Well, I've got some ideas that I've been working with for a long time, trying to explain to myself what's going on. And I talked a couple of weeks ago about the dual nature of the objectives. You know, the global war on terrorism that was launched by 9/11 has both an external purpose and an internal purpose. An external purpose of waging war anywhere in the world for purposes of conquest, conquest of resources, space, control, all of that, to govern the ungoverned spaces that they're worried about. But then internally as well, a major focus of the false flag attack of 9/11, in my view, was to enable states to massively increase control of their domestic populations. And this is what I mainly want to talk about today. I have a few more things to say about the external purposes, however, before I go on to the internal ones. And they're connected. The achievement of both sets of these purposes, internal and external, will allow the construction of this global control system that I call a global fascist terror state. So my contention is that there's really only one enemy in the eyes of the planners and propagandists and perpetrators of the 9/11 attacks, and that enemy is the working class, the world's population, basically. The working class is a technical term. I will define it. It doesn't just mean blue-collar workers. It means virtually everyone who lives on the planet, the vast majority of people who do not have independent wealth and have to work for a living, have to sell their ability to work to some buyer of their labor in order to get a job and get the money they need to live. Anybody who's in that situation, whether they're high-paid or low-paid, is in the working class. So I'm going to make a case today that the principal target of the 9/11 attacks is the working class. This is a different sort of an approach from that taken by most folks, it's an outgrowth of my own personal history and things I've studied and learned over the decades. And so I think it's a plausible analysis, and I want to lay it out for you, and you guys can evaluate it. I've put links up for today's show at the usual place, the Resistance Radio Forum, and in the chat room I provided a link to that show page, and you can get there if you're not in the chat room by going to resistradioforum and clicking on the link for today's page. Today's show. Okay, so I want to talk a little bit more about the ideas of Zbigniew Brzezinski, whose book in 1997, The Grand Chessboard, laid out a long-term plan, a long-term strategy for the United States. And really, when that book was published, the U.S. was already well advanced along this line. He was really rather, articulating a consensus, I believe, and so the consensus that he articulated was the notion of controlling Central Asia. And the purpose of controlling Central Asia was that any power which did control Central Asia would be able to dominate the entire region called Eurasia. It's like a two-continental region, a vast portion of Europe plus all of Asia, Eurasia. It's everything to the east of Germany and Poland, all the way to the Pacific coast, is the way Brzezinski defines Eurasia. So he felt that those who, a power which controlled Central Asia would really be able to dominate Eurasia. And the U.S. is already well underway in establishing control of Central Asia. Central Asia are the stands. I think Afghanistan properly is one of them, but this is Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, and Tajikistan. And these were former Soviet republics in the USSR, which became independent when the USSR fell apart. And so the plan was to peel these countries off from Russian controls, to take them out of the Russian zone of influence, so to speak. And the U.S. has already essentially done this. We have now military bases in all these countries. Right after Brzezinski's book came out in '97, the U.S. Congress in 1999, in March 1999, passed a major bill called the Silk Road Strategy Act, and this laid out in congressional formulations basically the same strategy that Brzezinski wrote about in his book. And so his strategy has been formally adopted by the United States government. There's no doubt about this. And here the idea is that the U.S., by controlling Central Asia, would be able to control the flow of natural gas and oil in whatever direction it desired. It would reduce Russia's influence over these resources. It would be able to, control what kind of access China would have to these. And Brzezinski's big notion is that if you control Eurasia, you control the world. And he has an argument to back that up. Brzezinski considered Russia at that time, the mid-'90s. Russia was he considered it the greater threat to the United States, United States interests, that is. And so the book is formulated with Russia more in the center than China. A lot of the goals that he laid out have been achieved or are in process that is being achieved, and so we're in a later phase now, another 15 years approximately down the line, and in that period China has surged upward in prominence and power, and probably right now the planners are looking more closely at China than Russia, as the recent ramping up of tensions with China that you may have noticed, especially around Korea, what's going on in the Koreas, indicates. Now let's see. So the U.S., we've got now military bases in Central Asia, and we also have bilateral relations with the rulers of each of these Central Asian countries. And although Russia still has relations with these countries as well, we've definitely moved in on Russia there. And it's sort of a mixed situation there, how complete U.S. control will be. So this is forcing Russia to, look more toward Western Europe for its economic activity, its trade and sales, and it doesn't have access to the resources in Central Asia to the degree that it did before. So it's forced Russia to change its orientation. It's sort of put Russia back on its heels. It's also allowed U.S. corporations to have access to these Central Asian countries, and has permitted U.S.-run agencies like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank to penetrate and offer, quote, aid and loans. And it's even involved the dollarization of these countries. That is, some of them have given up their national currencies and have just adopted the dollar as their money. So it's a very deep penetration. Brzezinski his book is pretty extraordinary, and it's an interesting read in Machiavellian thought, in the modern context for anybody. It's worth checking out. I've got a few passages. I thought I'd just try this. Haven't done this before, but I thought I'd try and read you just a few passages that are interesting. He introduces the language of Pearl Harbor, the concept of Pearl Harbor, early in the book on page 24. He says, "The attitude of the American public toward the external projection of American power has been ambivalent. The public supported America's engagement in World War II largely because of the shock effect of the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor." So here he's laying out an element in his argument that such a shock effect may be necessary to launch the kind of control that he foresees as necessary for the U.S. And then he says, "How America manages Eurasia is critical. Eurasia is the globe's largest continent and is geopolitically axial. A power that dominates Eurasia would control 2 of the world's 3 most advanced and economically productive regions. A mere glance at the map also suggests that control over Eurasia would almost automatically entail Africa's subordination, rendering the Western Hemisphere and Oceania geopolitically peripheral to the world's central continent. About 75% of the world's people live in Eurasia, and most of the world's physical wealth is there as well, both in its enterprises and underneath its soil. Eurasia accounts for 60% of the world's gross national product and about 3/4 of the world's known energy resources. So here he's laying out, the stakes here. This is, this is the big prize. Whoever controls this, and if it's the U.S., which already controls the Western Hemisphere, then you got it all locked up. Whoever controls Eurasia controls the world, especially if the U.S. can pull it off. And then he says, it is also a fact that America is too democratic at home to be autocratic abroad. This limits the use of America's power, especially its capacity for military intimidation. Never before has a populist democracy attained international supremacy. But the pursuit of power is not a goal that commands popular passion, except in conditions of a sudden threat or challenge to the public's sense of domestic well-being. The economic self-denial, that is, defense spending, and the human sacrifice, casualties, even among professional soldiers, required in the effort are uncongenial to democratic instincts. Democracy is inimical to imperial mobilization. And, he's stating these things are facts. The perspective is that this is not good. He's complaining. He's arguing against these restrictions on what he calls military intimidation. Military intimidation is a positive for Brzezinski. And then he translates his notions into language of an earlier period. He says, to put it in a terminology that harkens back to the more brutal age of ancient empires, the 3 grand imperatives of imperial geostrategy are to prevent collusion and maintain security dependence among the vassals, to keep tributaries pliant and protected, and to keep the barbarians from coming together. But then, he says, moreover, as America becomes an increasingly multicultural society, it may find it more difficult to fashion a consensus on foreign policy issues, except in the circumstance of a truly massive and widely perceived direct external threat. So, you can see how Machiavellian his thought is. And in 2001, in November 2001, right after September 11th happened, Michael C. Rupert published an article. I've got a link there at the forum on the subject of Brzezinski's book, and he went further and he quoted. He did an interview with a German, a former German defense ministry official who had been also in NATO, very associated with the Director General of NATO, Manfred Werner, and this guy Johannes Krüppel had contact with Brzezinski in the 80s and the 90s, and he realized in the 80s that he was a madman and that he was planning global domination, and he spoke out about it, and his career was destroyed, and he was locked out of his diplomatic career after that. So Rupert interviewed him, and Johannes Krüppel had this to say about Brzezinski, and this is after 9/11 happened. So he says the interests behind the Bush administration, such as the Council on Foreign Relations, the Trilateral Commission, founded by Brzezinski for David Rockefeller, and the Bilderberger Group, have prepared for and are now moving to implement open world dictatorship within the next 5 years. They are not fighting against terrorists. They are fighting against citizens.